So there I was, sitting in shul one Shabbat with a friend of mine at a call-up, an off-roof, and we're talking about the usual stuff. We're talking about sport and politics and business. And he's not Orthodox, and I'm like the go-to guy for all my non-Orthodox friends when it comes to matters of faith. And out of the blue, he says to me, "Can you tell me a bit about conversion?" And I'm thinking, I know why he's asking me, but he doesn't know that I know. So I start telling him about the conversion process and what's involved and the study and the different types of conversion and whether they're acceptable or not to everybody. And then he comes to the crunch. Well, you see, his son is going out with a non-Jewish girl. But she's a nice girl. She's studying to be a lawyer. Her father's a lawyer. They live in a nice suburb. They're a good family. But you know, he wants to have Jewish grandchildren. And I'm thinking, oh shit. Now this bothered me because I was brought up on a steady dose of what they call guilt-based Judaism. My late father survived the Holocaust and lost most of his family in the war. And in their life in Australia, my parents were focused on rebuilding. But I realised the limitations of this. This method of generational transition wouldn't work for the future. We can't guilt millennials into doing anything, and I'd never want to. I needed to find a method of transmitting Judaism to the next generation that worked for my family and worked for others as well. And there was this whole business of having Jewish grandchildren, because you can't have grandchildren in the same way you have children. Having grandchildren is the result of a choice made by somebody else. And we can't control that. We can want to have Jewish grandchildren, but the time for doing any action about that is not when our children are all grown up. So there's a paradox here. On the one hand, my friend aspired to something, but it was something over which he had no direct control. Now, the idea of Jewish grandchildren is something that has very, very old history. And we go back to the Torah, to Bereshit, and the story of Ephraim and Manasseh. And towards the end of Bereshit, it's the last days of Yosef, and the pasuk said, "Vayar Yosef leEphraim b'nei Shileshim." Yosef lived to see great-grandchildren. This would have to be the first documented case of Yiddish nachas. So in Ephraim and Manasseh, we have an example of Jewish continuity that spans multiple generations. As I said, you can't have Jewish grandchildren, and Judaism is transmitted one generation at a time. So in fact, the Talmud gives us a model of transmission that could be helpful here. The Talmud and the Mishnah spend a lot of energy discussing and debating measures and metrics because they form the boundaries of any Torah law. Really, in any legal system, it's all about the detail. For example, at the Seder, we eat matzah. How much matzah do we have to eat to fulfill the mitzvah? We eat in a sukkah. How big does the sukkah have to be? How much schach does it have to have? And the same applies on the flip side. We can't eat pork. But how much do we have to eat to be deemed to have committed an offence that is worthy of punishment? These are all questions that are debated ad infinitum. Now, there's one measure that is discussed in relation to purity and impurity, and that answers the question, how wet is wet enough? And the answer given is unlike anything else. The answer is tofeach al manas lahatfiach, wet enough to make something else wet. Now, this is a measure unlike anything else. This is not an absolute measure, a number of fluid ounces spread over a number of square inches. This is a relative measure. But wet enough to make something else wet actually gives us a generic model for transmission. Now, the rabbis aren't happy with this, of course. How wet is that really, they ask. And the answer is that wet hands that are on the way to becoming dry are no longer able to impart moisture. Wet hands need to be freshly wet. In terms of transmission of Judaism, this means that our Judaism, the Judaism we practice, needs to be fresh. For me, that means thinking about connecting with my Judaism at least once a day. For you, it might mean something else. But once a year Judaism can't help but be stale. Now, as I've said, Judaism is transmitted one generation at a time. So in order to have Jewish grandchildren, we need to make sure the Judaism in our children is fresh. How do we do that? Well, let's look back at Ephraim and Manasseh, and particularly their father Yosef. Yosef's Judaism was fresh. Why? Because he got this, not surprisingly, from his father. He studied with his father for many years before he was sold into slavery. As a slave, he was morally challenged with Potiphar's wife, and he looked to the image of his father to give him the moral strength to overcome the challenge. He kept his Judaism fresh. He kept his study fresh because he recalled it and revised it, so that even after 22 years away from his family, he was able to recall the laws that he was studying with his father. There's something else about Yosef. He is known as Yosef HaTzadik, Joseph the Righteous. What is a tzaddik? The first biblical character who is referred to as a tzaddik is Noach. Noach ish tzaddik, Noah was a righteous man. What do Yosef and Noach have in common? They both stood up for what was right despite being in a hostile environment. Yosef lived his life according to absolute standards rather than lower himself to the standards of those around him. And in Egypt, the bar was pretty low. So while we might think of a tzaddik as a pious man with a beard who sits and studies all day, let's throw out that stereotype. This teaches us that a tzaddik is someone who has the internal strength to withstand peer pressure. That is a tzaddik. The other part of how is Parenting 101, to model the behaviour that we would like to see from our children, to know that our children are smart and perceptive, that they look at what we do as a measure of what is important to us, to show our children by example that Judaism is important by living it, to show our children by example that we can overcome peer pressure and that we can live our lives not relative to the people around us. Yosef lived his life by absolute standards. Yosef did more than that. He thrived in a hostile environment in the foreign land of Egypt. Who has to do this? It falls on us, parents and role models. And if we look back again at Ephraim and Manasseh, living in Egypt, their only role models were their parents. Yosef and his wife Osnat couldn't send the boys on the school bus every day to Old Canaan Hebrew Academy. Instead, every day they walked down the road to Ramses High School and studied and socialised all day with their Egyptian friends and colleagues. They must have had a strong grounding in their Jewish home to prepare them for this. While Jewish schools and programs and youth groups are all drivers of Jewish continuity, these things are a product of families for whom Jewish continuity is already important. We can't live a life disconnected from Jewishness and then outsource Jewish continuity to the local institutions. When does this have to start happening? As soon as possible. So we see in Ephraim and Manasseh an example of how to live in the Jewish diaspora. There's something else about Ephraim and Manasseh. They were the model for the blessing for Jewish children. When Yaakov blessed them before his death, the pasuk said, "Vayavarech otam lemor," and Yaakov blessed them, saying, "B'cha yivarech Yisrael lemor." In your name, Israel should be blessed, saying the famous words, "Yisimcha Elokim ke Ephraim v'chi Manasseh." May God make you like Ephraim and Manasseh. Their blessing is the blessing for children because they were blessed by their grandfather, Yaakov. And the love of a grandparent to grandchildren is the purest love of all. Any parent knows the emotional baggage that exists between parents and children and how grandparents are able to transcend that. In addition, Ephraim and Manasseh were the first Jews born and raised outside of Israel. They were elevated to tribe status so they could be models of life in the Jewish diaspora. The key to Jewish life in the diaspora is to be able to swim against the tide, to be able to withstand peer pressure. And therefore, the blessing for children is the blessing of continuity. That's all very good, but what do I tell my friend whose children are all grown up? What can he do now? And the answer is that it's never too late. And the best person we can learn from is a shepherd by the name of Akiva. He was a shepherd all his life and tried to study Torah but didn't succeed. And one day with his flock, he noticed some water falling on rocks. And where the water was dripping, drip, drip, there was a hole in the rock. And he looked at this and he said, wow, if water can do this with a rock, perhaps I too, with enough application, can study Torah. At the age of 40, he gave up his life as a shepherd and went to study Torah. It took him a few years and he became Rabbi Akiva, one of the greatest scholars of the Mishnaic period. So the answer is, it's never too late. And it's all based on the amazing human capacity for change. But it starts with us. It starts with us freshening our own Judaism, with our children, but really with us. And it's amazing what a daily dose of Judaism can do to our lives. It can be quite transformative in freshening our lives and freshening our Judaism. It really comes down to our choices in life. We can choose a life partner and choose to have children with them. We can't choose to have Jewish grandchildren. The fact is, we didn't choose to be born Jewish. Our choice is how we live as Jews. Whether we let our Judaism wither and dry, or whether we keep our Judaism fresh and vibrant. And if we do that, our Judaism will automatically transmit to those closest to us, who see in us a dogma chaya, a living example of Judaism. What makes us Jewish may be our grandparents, but what keeps us Jewish is our grandchildren. Thank you.